A decade full of accomplishments, rebellion, music, free love, civil rights, wars, hippies, and concerned parents. You guessed it, the 1960s. While there was a clash of cultures transitioning from the 50s to the 60s, many people wanted to express their new individuality instead of traditionally men working and making money for the family, and women staying at home, cleaning and cooking. Many people love to go out and hang around with each other, but many also love to gather around the television with their loved ones to watch shows, cartoons, and the biggest moment of 1969, Apollo 11's moon landing.
April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot in the evening on a balcony by James Earl Ray at a motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was rushed to a hospital where he was later pronounced dead. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great civil rights leader, and riots broke out across the country when news spread about his death. President Lyndon B. Johnson declared it a national day of mourning. Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister and a civil rights leader who led many nonviolent protests and marches like the Montgomery bus boycott to end segregation on buses and the 1963 March on Washington for rights and jobs. After years of campaigning, Martin Luther King Day was signed in by President Ronald Reagan and celebrated in 1986.
When you're looking at a mural, you see a moon in the top right corner. Now you might wonder, well, there was a moon before the 60s, why is it so influential now? Well, on July 20th, 1969, the space shuttle Apollo 11 landed on the moon. It had left the Kennedy Space Center in Florida only 4 days before its landing, carrying Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, 238,855 miles away from the Earth. The effects of Apollo 11 landing were extreme. Armstrong called it,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind,"
expressing that this was a huge step for society in terms of technology, and upon the return of the ship, President Richard M. Nixon said, "This is the greatest week in the history of the world since its creation." Arthur C. Clarke, a well-known writer at the time, said, "I think in the long run, the money that's been put into the space program is one of the best investments this country has ever made. This is a down payment on the future of mankind. It is as simple as that," showing that the majority of society believed that this landing was a huge step forward to the future of our world and its technology.
The largest component of our mural is a mushroom cloud, which symbolizes both the public fear of Cold War attacks and the flood of psychedelic drug experimentation that was a large part of the 60s counterculture movement. In the middle of the mural looms this mushroom cloud, a metaphorical fear of mutually assured destruction that overtook the American public in the 60s. The most intense Cold War conflict in the decade was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which began after the U.S. failed to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba with President Eisenhower's Bay of Pigs invasion, to which Castro responded by corresponding with Soviet forces to place defensive nuclear missiles in Cuba in July of 1962. U.S. surveillance flights discovered Soviet arms, including Soviet Il-28 bombers, and according to the United States Department of State, on September 4th, 1962, President Kennedy issued a public warning against the introduction of offensive weapons into Cuba. Nevertheless, on the 14th of October, a U.S. aircraft observed, and I quote, "sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles under construction in Cuba," end quote. So, on October 22nd, Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, making his announcement on public television and alarming the public.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev.
This fear of mass destruction is represented in our mural by the mushroom cloud. The second meaning the mushroom cloud holds is evident in its psychedelic design. Depicted as the focal point of our mural, it represents another popular drug of the 60s, the psychedelic mushroom. But it wasn't all mushrooms. There was more recreational use of harder drugs such as cocaine and heroin and amphetamines, but the most common drug was marijuana. Before the 60s, marijuana was typically used by American jazz musicians. According to the University of Virginia, the beatniks followed the lead of these inner-city hipsters and emulated their style by referencing and praising mind-expanding drugs in poems, novels, essays, and music. By the mid-60s, LSD, or acid, was common across the country, especially among young people, in part thanks to Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey, so-called acid gurus, who encouraged and justified the drug's recreational use as a way to gain insight about the chaotic world around them. That drug went hand in hand with the popular music of the decade. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles describes the world created by acid, and is literally named according to the letters LSD. The drug became illegal in 1965, and psychedelic mushrooms became illegal by 1970.
The biggest part of our mural is the oil slick mushroom cloud. This was specifically chosen to represent the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Vietnam War in 1962. The colors added to the cloud show the psychedelic feel of the decade and the types of drugs many people were on. The two men leaning against this cloud are former Presidents John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who primarily ran during the 60s, specifically 1963 to 1969. Above President Johnson, we have the moon with the United States flag waving in the wind. This is chosen to represent Apollo 13's mission in 1969, in which three men, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, were the first ever to land on the moon. Directly below that are some strawberry fields, a pop culture reference to the band The Beatles, and characters from popular TV shows that started in the 60s and are still running and well known today. Characters from Sesame Street and the Muppets are playing in the fields. Finally, the next field over is a protest, more specifically a protest to free love and civil rights, led by former civil rights activist Martin Luther King. You can see the rule of thirds used in this mural with the moon in one corner, MLK in another corner, and the mushroom cloud in the middle. The colors we decided to use are all very light and bright, but still pop out to catch the attention, just like how the clothing did in the 60s. Altogether, these pieces are unforgettable, decade-defining moments of the 1960s.